Hi everybody, how are you today? It's, let me tell you how great it is to be back in a non-student capacity. Yes, good. All right, just a couple of questions so that I know the crowd, because I think, as part of our training, we get very used to talking to a very, very narrow audience, and I just want to get a little bit of a sense of who I'm talking to today. So, how many of you are linguists? Just raise your hand. You are in the linguistic. Oh, right. See, I'm glad I asked this question. Who here is not a linguist? Then go ahead and be honest. Okay. All right. Since you're not a linguist, what do you do? What's your discipline?
Oh, I just started teaching ESL.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, to very beginners. So.
Oh, you're brand spanking new.
Yeah, and to very spanking new people.
Yeah. Oh, great. They're really, really cool to work with, I have to say. I grew a lot as a teacher when I did, so yeah. And you? What discipline are you in?
Education policy?
You're in education policy. I'm writing an article for you at some point. Yeah. Yeah, good. Okay, and then next question is, how many of you have actually looked at language data before? Raise your hands again if you've looked at language data in some form. Okay. And how many of you are primarily interested in discourse type stuff? How many of you are interested in cognitive type stuff? How many of you have not figured it out yet? Okay, and it's okay if you don't. I mean, I kind of think we need to go through cycles of learning and teaching and learning and teaching and to kind of figure out where our interests lie. So I'm really pleased to share with you today where my interests lie, at least one aspect of them. My research is kind of is one small piece of what I hope to have bloom into a much larger research and professional development agenda. The core of what I was doing was really kind of looking at how language develops in the brain. I had a conversation early on in my career with Dr. Han. I'm like, I just want to know the best way to teach. And she turned around and said, well, then you really need to have an understanding of how learning happens. And that conversation stuck with me, as you can tell, because it's been 12 years. That conversation stuck with me. And I'm really pleased that I was able to look at get a glimpse of what learning looks like, and get a sense of its timelines of development and patterns of development. And so here we are today. So the framework that I was working in is what's called an emergentist framework. It's this idea that we aren't necessarily born with innate language structure in our minds, but it kind of, you add a little bit of water and sunshine and it blooms inside of you. Okay, that water and sunshine being stuff from the language environment, and we have learning mechanisms. But we don't necessarily have language structure predetermined in our heads. Okay? Language acquisition results from the interaction of domain general learning mechanisms and exposure to language. So the things that allow us to learn math and to learn to dance and all these other things, that's what they consider domain general. There's been a debate for many years about domain specificity, which would be the Chomsky camp in general. The other important point is that patterns of language use influence the learning path. Okay? So the kinds of language environments that we are exposed to and the way we use language and practice language has some, not an entire effect, but has some effect on the way we learn language. Okay? Individuals have different first and second language experiences across a lifetime. Therefore, language acquisition demonstrates idiosyncratic features across and within individuals. Okay? None of us have the same language experience in terms of the number of words we use per day, the repeated words we use per day, the language exposure we had. I lived in France for a year and you didn't. And all of that affects how our neurons line up in our brain and the kinds of pathways that are established. So there are a couple of core concepts that kind of form this backdrop of the study that is important to emergentist beliefs. During the development of language features, during language development, language features proliferate, they compete, and then they select for communicative needs. So Even this even goes for monolingual speakers. That our brain kind of trims away the things we don't use, and so they become slower to access. And then the things we use more frequently, our brain accesses them faster, and kind of reinforces neural pathways for those kinds of things to happen. Okay. And then, as you may or may not be aware, acquisition is nonlinear and complex. And gee, I wish things were simple. It would have made my research a whole lot easier, but in fact what we have to do is we really have to celebrate this last point. I mean, this is kind of what makes things interesting for us. So nonetheless, there is a need to validate emergentist claims about second language acquisition. I mean, I'm a little bit agnostic on this whole issue. I think it's important to be cautious as much as I want to throw my arms around emergentism and say, goodbye, Mr. Chomsky, I never want to speak to you again. We nonetheless need to be cautious. And so my study is really just kind of looking at, well, emergentists say this happens, does it? Okay. All right, so a couple of concepts that we're going to be working with today. There is the learner chunk, which is a multi-morphemic sequence that is processed holistically by the learner. Okay. And it doesn't necessarily have to be target-like. Okay. All it has to do is just be multi-morphemic, and that the brain handles it like a single unit. For fluency purposes, essentially. Okay. And so you'll see things like there have 3 dogs. Okay. And so we're kind of looking at this idea that the brain of the learner has somehow stored there have as a single unit. Okay. The learner may not necessarily have full knowledge of the constituents. I had a student once that was like, Professor Tim, what does first of all mean? I'm like, first of all. Yeah, first of all, you got to do this, and then second of all, you got to do that. I'm like, oh, first of all. But she had a meaning roughly attached to it. She knew a context when it was used. Okay, so it was kind of like an imperfect form, meaning, use mapping. All right, and we know that to be true of second language learners. Okay. Morphemes can be subject to both holistic intake. So she hears first of all, and it goes in as a single unit. Okay. The learner never hears there have, except from other non-native speakers, and yet forms it. Okay? And so you can get things being formed through patterns of language use, or they can be intaken, if you will. SLA needs to come up with a better verb. They can be formed after intake. Okay? And then the other feature is called a construction. And really, in emergentist and usage-based theories, we got rid of grammar rules per se, and trees really, and we said, you know what, everything's a construction. It's a form meaning mapping, right? It can be monomorphemic, like the word dog. Okay, it can be multi-morphemic, like at the end of the day, and good morning, good afternoon, and good night. Okay, and it can be rule-like, which means it's abstract, okay? A subject-verb-object construction or a passive construction. And to emergentists, all 3 of these things are what they call constructions. We today are particularly interested in the last one, right? Because we want to know, how does a learner get those? Okay. And then another item that I just need to introduce you to is this thing called an n-gram. Anybody ever work in corpus or have any familiarity with corpus studies at all? Okay, so an n-gram is when a computer looks at language data and spits out a whole list of the language data contents. Okay, and it kind of groups things in sequences, like number of 2-word sequences, all right, and 3-word sequences. And those 2-word sequences and 3-word sequences are called n-grams. So you have bigrams, trigrams, all the way on up. So form meaning use is, we're looking to see how those bundles are formed in the mind. Okay. So the focus of the study is this. So drawing on an understanding of first language acquisition, Nick Ellis proposed that one path, not the only path, but one path by which learners can develop abstract constructions is through chunks. What happens is that a learner starts off with a chunk, gradually figures out the moving parts and starts inserting other things, or starts taking those parts and moving them to other places. But it's a gradual process. Okay, and what pushes that gradual process along is that learning mechanisms are interacting with patterns of language use. Okay, and so especially with usage-based theories, they put a lot of emphasis on input frequency. Okay, so the more frequent something happens, the more frequent things get chunked, but also the more frequent things can get broken apart as well. And regularities across chunks and other exemplars, which are just little experiences of language use that are remembered, are gradually abstracted such that rule-like constructions emerge. Right? And so, therefore, what we would expect to see overall is this thing called grammaticalization, where features of chunks and other patterns gradually expand into different contexts. So my questions are this: if grammaticalization of chunks is a characteristic of L1 learning, given the added complexities inherent in adult learning context and cognition, like they have a second language or they have a first language, and they may only be learning in schools or not at all in schools, that kind of thing, to what extent do adult learners of English as a second language use chunks for the purposes of acquisition? And so I used Nick Ellis's path that we saw back there, just as kind of a heuristic to move through the data. First of all, do learners actually use chunks? And if so, what chunks do they use? And then finally, is there any evidence of those chunks changing over time? Right, the design was exploratory. It took 10 months, a collective case study design. So I got 3 learners together from a New Jersey community college. They agreed to meet with me outside of class. They were full-time intermediate ESL students. We had Wakey, who was 20 years old. His first language was Chinese. His length of residence was 4 months. He had 12 years of English instruction prior to arriving at in the United States. And he lived with his aunt and cousin, and he spoke both English and Chinese at home. English primarily with his 12-year-old cousin, and mix of Chinese and English with his aunt. Eddie was a 22-year-old. His first language was Korean, 6 months, like his brother. And like his brother, he had 10 years of instruction in English in Korea. And he lived with both his parents and his brother. Everybody spoke Korean at home, and then they were heavily involved with their church on weekends, and their church being a Korean church, so they only spoke Korean in their church as well. So context matters, right? Which is kind of I include this as a subtext, even though I can't necessarily make correlations in the data about why things happen. I think it's important that we just sort of keep this in mind for future study. I don't know. So, you got to get language samples from your students, all right? Or from your research subjects. And what I wanted were these things called clinically and elicited general samples. And they exist for the purpose of controlled research. You need some kind of control in the research. But I also wanted naturalistic language as best that I could. And so you kind of need this trade-off. And I found that clinically elicited general samples were the way to go, okay? And you want individual variation to become apparent, because that's important, in referencing emergentist beliefs about language, okay? Furthermore, in naturalistic language, the literature attests the fact that those are the processing conditions in which chunks are used. Right? So if you're to build a mousetrap, you gotta. If I'm looking to get chunks, I need language samples and conditions, elicitation conditions to actually get those chunks. All right. I don't want the study design shooting me in the foot. So, what was an example of an elicitation instrument? Well, I had 3. I had a narrative task, where the learners would look at a series of pictures. Eaton's book was really good, provided me with a couple, but at some point I'm like, I need some more. So I started clipping things out of YouTube and sticking them into Comic Life and creating my own comics, if you will. And that way I had some control over the content that the learners would be talking about. And a lot of these elicitation tasks, they actually had 10 panes in them, so they weren't just like 4. Okay? And just to give you an idea of what it sounded like.
Yes,
Look at that. Okay, that was Wakey. That's what he sounded like when he was working through tasks like that. Okay, another elicitation instrument was a role play. I actually got this one from one of the assessment conferences. Go to assessment conferences. You'll really learn. It's a great way to learn how to get language data. All right. Yeah, you learn some really good tricks there. Okay. And so yeah, I attended Kirby Grabowski's presentation with Jim Purpura, and here were these role plays, which create context of naturalistic language use, or naturalistic, not necessarily natural. And so you set up these kind of discourse environments. All right. So first, role A, you have you've been waiting for your friend to arrive because you're meeting him or her for coffee. Your friend is 45 minutes late. You're very frustrated, and then your friend is always late. So you're setting the psychological context and disposition. Okay, and then you set up some discourse goals for person A. And then what's important for these things to work, and there's kind of an art to designing these, is you need to kind of set up another person at cross purposes. And so what you'll see if you read the other one is that they're on slightly different psychological planes, and they need to negotiate to get there. And it's that negotiation that generates a bunch of talk. And I'll tell you right now, if anybody wants a couple of these to try out in their classroom, you can certainly email me, because these make really great ESL classroom activities. And you read a couple, you kind of see how they work, you start designing a few, maybe tweak them per the language ability of your learners. Okay? Role play allows for the dynamic relationship between the social, the cultural, the affective, and the linguistic features present in real life communication, but again, with methodological control. All right, and then finally we had a third task, which really wasn't a task per se, or I should say they had the least amount of structure. I called it the live talk task, but really what I was doing was recording the small talk between me and the learners in and around the, around the other two tasks. I wanted this to be as genuine as possible. I'd ask questions like I would ask anybody else, because I want to have a conversation, because it's just a way of relaxing. And so, once I saw the conversation was going, I would step back, right, and just keep recording. So what you get are your task characteristics here. You've got your narrative, which is primarily monologic, and then you've got your role play and your live talk, which are both dialogic. Okay, and then you look at the nature of the talk. Where are the meanings coming from? Okay, and in the narrative, the discourse requirements and meanings are heavily predetermined by the task, whereas the role play, the learners have a lot more. They have a lot more ability to control how the conversation goes, okay, and what exactly they're going to be saying. I kind of outline it, but they can kind of choose, how they want to get there. And then the live talk is, it's a lot more spontaneous, because at the time I just didn't know where chunks were going to come from. I kind of wanted to cast as wide a net as possible, and this was my way of doing that. Okay. And I'm pleased to say it worked. It worked, and I was able to see what I saw. So what you do is you record them, and then you have to transcribe them, and that takes forever. And then you build that into a corpus. So what you see I have here is just this range of text files, all right, from February 02, February 11th. I went all the way into like October, I believe. So, yeah, there we are. And actually, let me just show you real quick what a what was it? Alt Shift?
Yes. Yes.
So that's what Wakey said on 02/25. So February 25th, there's a man working in the office with a computer, and then he didn't eat. Okay. And we set it up like that. With the discourse ones, where he was actually talking with somebody else, because I was looking at this from a corpus perspective at times, I just kind of cut and paste all of that particular person's talk into a single file and separated them out. I didn't need to be looking at turn taking for my purposes at this time, although it would absolutely be worthwhile to do so in the future. No. What's that?
Third one.
Third one? There we go. Okay. All right. So human coding, after you get it all in text, then you have to start poring over it, looking for the things you're looking for. And I was looking for chunks, and my second rater was also looking for chunks. And we needed a criterion list in order to identify what we thought might be chunks. Okay, at the very least, the forms have to be multi-morphemic. Okay, and then any combination of secondary criteria. And the problem is that the literature is pretty loosey-goosey on this, which is one of the things that was just one of the challenges. And this was an exploratory study. It's like, well, how well these criteria actually work in real life, right? And so, in a lot of respects, it's like, well, it can be one of these, but not the others. And so really what I found I was ending up doing was just really just raising likelihoods of things being chunks. Right? All right, and then once you get your corpus, you start looking, I use the computer software called AntConc to look in the data and find things. Okay? So it was a way of quickly being able to research particular structures and scan many files of text to find particular language features. Okay? And I was also working against this idea in the literature that numerous people have said that if a learner uses the same construction twice, so it only has to be used twice, that there's a likelihood it's a chunk. Okay? Well, the computer software is good at counting things. In fact, that's all it's really good for, is counting things. At least I could get, well, okay, how many things occurred twice or more, all right? And the computer generates a list of that, right? But the computer doesn't have a chunk per se where it's looking at morphemes that are free and bound. Really, this computer software and most others, they are really counting spaces in between words, and so spaces are the boundaries, which means that it's not really looking at the plural S morpheme, for example. Okay, it'll look at 2 dogs and see that there's 2 units as opposed to 3 grammatical or lexical units there, right? Okay, and so with that frequency criterion in mind, just trying to see how true that might be, we use the computer software, and we were looking for meaningful sequences that could be processed as a whole. Really just have to consider that the computer approach was really just a way of raising our attention to possibilities. So the computer would create a list, and then we as humans would go through the list and make our judgments there. All right. So what did I do for my analysis? I had some descriptive statistics, and I counted the number of n-grams and chunk use. I had a task analysis where I identified chunks in discourse context with respect to function. I used a chunk-based analysis, and so I identified longitudinal changes in a chunk with respect to form while maintaining its linguistic function. That's the important part. You have to have you take the word going, all right? It's got two functions. One is the actual verb of going somewhere, and then one actually is as part of communicating future, all right? So by this criteria, I have to stick to it, so only its uses in future. Okay. All right, and what did I find? Well, total number of tasks, Wakey had 48 tasks, Eddie had 52 tasks, and June had 56. A couple days they were absent, kind of thing. The corpus size, who was the most talkative? Wakey, yes, he was. Interestingly, he was the least talkative at the beginning. He was the least communicative because he had just arrived. And so he wasn't up to speed. But boy, when he got speed, he kept talking. Which is, that tells you something about language development, right? And n-gram types. So I was looking at sequences of 3 words or more, right? And which n-grams of those 3 words or more occurred at least 3 or more times. Okay, so you have to set up a criteria, because otherwise you just get, if you do 2 and 2, you end up exponentially with 10,000 n-grams, right? And the idea was, well, if we limit it to 3 words or more, then the likelihood of it overlapping with units of meaning and not so much data noise, that was the issue. That's the trade-off. that's what you get. So I had some sane numbers. N-gram tokens. Are you familiar with types versus tokens? So types is the number of different ones, and then tokens is the number of times they are either repeated, or that they're repeated, all right, or used. And so you look at a type token ratio, and that type token ratio really helps you get at the idea of how much are they repeating the same thing, the same sequences over and over again. And then on the last column, I have human-coded chunks, and so that's where the human was listening to the recordings, and based on those criteria, was saying that might be a chunk, that might be a chunk, that might be a chunk. And what you see is that there's the same rank order. Okay, so that humans were finding, certainly according to overlapping but different cues, they were finding the same kind of talk characteristics from each of the learners. Thought that was interesting. Right. So, what were the findings? Okay, so research question number 2. We already established that they did use chunks. What chunks do they use? So the way I answered that was I took the output from one of the role plays, and I came up with this giant list. All right, from just one role play, and these are human coded. Okay, and again, consider them possibilities, because I think you really need to enter into a chain of argumentation of how likely is each one of these a chunk, right? And me and my other coder, we kind of felt pretty good that these could likely be chunks, okay? All right, so wiki, all the time, and do your best, all right? Those, I think, we intuitively feel like, yeah, my brain stores all that as a whole, all right? The question is, do learners store things as a whole different than native speakers? I think is an important question to ask. All right? Give me the money. All right? I am tired. I am tired. So, all right. And then more contentious was things like if the. All right. I'll leave that as an open question. Maybe we'll discuss it a bit later. Research question number 3, do chunks change over time? And so how do we characterize that change? Well, there was this thing I found called pattern replication, where the same template set up by the chunk was starting to be applied to other words. All right, so what's happened now, you started off with what's happened, all right, and then sooner or later you got what's going on. So the what's bit, is starting to be used in other places. Pattern reconfiguration, which is the morphology inside the chunk, is changed. Okay, so you go from what's going on to what's going on. Okay, and then pattern association, where there are new associations of the morphosyntax near the chunk. Okay, and so if the chunk was do you have, you'll notice in the first example it's do you have tent, articles missing, and that's a very common trait, okay, among language learners. But then we see do you have a appear and do you have any. And emergentists and usage-based people, they think of language as associations. Okay, and so what we see is this strengthening of association between these units here, right? And that's the belief underlying grammatical change or construction change in emergentist systems. Why are you laughing? And I think as an ESL teacher, I am forever trying to get my learners to associate this morpheme right here with the stuff that's going on over here. We're always pointing out these dependencies. So getting them to associate those is part of our job as ESL teachers. All right. So addressing the overall research question, to what extent do adult L2 learners use chunks for the purposes of acquisition? Well, there were inter and intra-learner differences in the extent of chunk use. Okay. The data suggested that chunks and monomorphemic units are subject to the same processes, which make chunks only partially complicit in L2 acquisition. When I started out looking at that little developmental path, I'm like, yes, maybe everything starts as a chunk and then everything breaks down, I'll be done in 6 months. No, it's far, far, far more messy than that. And I think, basically, chunks are not necessarily the starting point. They can be, but they aren't necessarily the starting point for grammatical development. And that was Nick Ellis's argument as well. But chunks can also be built halfway through a developmental path or a developmental stage, across stages as well. And finally, go figure, grammaticalization was nonlinear, right, and complex. And I think, if you're familiar with U-shaped patterns in language learning, learner starts out correct, and then a few weeks or months later, they're making errors associated with that language feature. So they're incorrect, and then they go back to being correct again, but correct with a more robust representation of those language features. All right, and then kind of referencing back to the earlier slide, emergentists believe in proliferation, interaction, or competition and selection. Yeah, I saw that. And so this validates an emergentist view as well. So chunk forms emerge along with monomorphemic forms to express the same concepts, right? So you're getting more than one way of expressing an idea. And that's what proliferation is. You got one idea, the learner starts off one-to-one, and then develops 3 other ways of expressing that idea. That's the essence there. Interaction or competition, literature says competition. So what you get are chunked and non-chunked forms interacting, like they're crashing into the same utterance as you have right here. He will gonna too. I was happy when I saw that. You know what I mean? Teachers freak out when they see errors, and I'm like, don't freak out. It's exciting, right? And then we have selection. So after a while, after the proliferation of some linguistic forms, then the learner's stopping using some of them and reverting or resting on a narrower subset. Okay, and so you kind of have this, this core, and then an expansion, and then a contraction of features in the language system. And so yeah, he used there have a lot, but over time he started using there have less and less, which is kind of what you want to see, and it's progressing towards target likeness. And then for Eddie, a little bit was the purpose for the adverbial role primarily, whereas a little was regulated to adjectival roles, and that's what we see in selection. Like it's like, this is for this, that's for that. All right. And so what the conclusion I drew is that there seems to be, and it makes sense from my perspective, that selection occurs along semantic or functional lines. That we allocate purposes for things and use them accordingly. What were some limitations? Well, school year, so there were breaks in data collection for March, May, and August, which interrupted evidence of patterns. I mean, it would have been nice to have, every week of every month, just to not miss anything, but people go away, and so I kind of felt like in my data there were a lot of dead ends. I was kind of on a path to something, and then the data would stop and. Okay. The length of the data collection, well, keep in mind that this 10-month window corresponded with a particular stage of learner development, okay? And so that was a window where the interlanguage was solving developmentally specific linguistic problems. So, that is to say that these patterns that I saw, am I going to say that it's the same of all learners of all levels? No, not necessarily, okay? That would certainly be something to ask for future study. And and then the other thing is, like, if I had an extended time frame, would I see different resolutions, or what, how would things evolve, okay? And would grammaticalization necessarily characterize things beyond that window? There were some intercoder differences, and those intercoder differences were attributable to the number of recordings that each had to work with. And that's probably something in retrospect, that would have been better to balance things a little bit better in that respect. So for future study, besides input frequency, I would want to investigate what other characteristics of language environment or language use catalyze the emergence of chunks in grammaticalization. This study looked at output, okay, and said, and looked and said, is there any pattern that's available in the output that I can see? But we want to know how those patterns might get there. And so looking at more, taking an input-based perspective would be helpful. Having a deeper understanding of interactions between the L1 language history and L2 patterns of use. Yeah, transfer. Sure. Transfer probably helped chunks get formed, or, you know, that's a no-brainer. Certainly, you know, I think some time spent articulating that a bit more. And finally, if environmental and use differences can alter the learning path, are there synergies between instructed and non-instructed learning environments that can be capitalized on? So it's this idea that, you know, your learning environment dictates how certain parts of your language development occurs, or influences, I wouldn't say dictates, okay? You got your instructed learning and your non-instructed learning, and quite frankly, you know, according to the literature, there are beneficial aspects to both, right? And so if you know, for example, if instructed learners have a high degree of analysis and not a lot of chunks, whereas learners who learn by ear have a high degree of chunks but not a lot of analysis, well, maybe, you know, but chunks that create possibilities for fluency, well, then there's a benefit. And, you know, can we engineer our instructional environment so that we are taking advantage of all of the brain's capacities for learning language? All right, and I've got a number of acknowledgments. There. Okay, so real quick. Just pass those out, please. So what I have is I have an n-gram list, and I want to put you in my seat. There we were with these n-gram lists. What I want you to do is I want you to cross out the things you're like, no, definitely could not be a chunk. The learner, that would not likely be stored in the learner's mind as a single unit. All right? That's just the computer talking to you. All right? And anything you think is, yeah, definitely a chunk, I don't know, put a plus or a check or a star next to it. Okay? And anything else, just ignore it. Okay? Tell you what, row in the front, why don't you look at the first page? Row in the back, why don't you look at the second page? Okay. I see a good number of X's and check marks. Yeah, so this is kind of a, you know, this is kind of an experientially representative of the process I was going through. So the computer dumps out a whole bunch of data, and you've got to figure out the likelihood of which one might be a chunk or which one might not. Okay, so you have to sift out the data noise, all right, that occurs just by virtue of the process, which is the computer software, and then, you know, start your argumentation for chunkhood, if you will. So, folks in the front, what was definitely not a chunk? Give me a couple examples there. What's the noise in the data? The, I, and. So we got our little reduplication there. And what? Yeah. So the duplicates. Okay. Folks in the back. Besides the duplicates, what do you have? He, okay.
That's duplicate.
Like a?
Like, that's duplicate.
Like, that's a duplicate, yeah.
Just and I.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So, you know, what happens is that when you're listening to these recordings, and the learner's, you know, trundling along and goes, and, like, and a boy and a girl, right? And, or, and the. They repeat it. That learner, like, repeated a bunch of times, and furthermore, they were fluent when they repeated it. So, is it possible that that learner, and this was something that was raised in my defense, which I'm entirely sympathetic to, in fact, was something I wanted to talk more about, was the fact that we don't know exactly how, you know, what the learner is representing in their mind as a chunk. You know, we use frequency as a way of, frequency data as a way of raising the possibilities. What I should have done is, you know, in an ideal world, is do a little bit of follow-up with some more focused tasks to somehow maybe figure out if phrases like and the or and are actually in some way, you know, stored as a chunk. Because and just means introduce noun after other noun. That's its function. So it's a unit, you could argue. Right? and yes, you need some argumentation to set that up. But I think you know, if you've been trained kind of classically, if you will, that you're used to kind of like these Chomsky, this is the noun phrase. Noun phrase starts with an article and ends with, you know, a noun. Okay, and therefore that means that the article is actually not part of something else. But who knows what it is in the learner's mind? And an emergentist kind of rejects that strict formalism and says, well, look, all it is it's a function that says it's plus noun plus and an introduction of noun. That's kind of its concept, if you will. Okay, so for that reason, we don't necessarily want to discard it, okay, or completely rule it out. All right. How about something that you really felt was definitely a chunk? Absolutely, like you could take it to the bank. What's that?
I don't know.
I don't know. Ah, yeah, that's an appealing one, isn't it? Absolutely, and yeah, it's an idiomatic thing. People say it all the time. Learners said it all the time. It achieves a function. Okay. I think, yeah. So you got these subject-verb combinations, yeah. In the back.
Pay attention.
Pay attention, yeah. Do you have, yeah. So you got a request function, yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
For like the ones like and I and he and she,
Uh-huh.
would that be as part of the having the chunk but then substituting different things in it?
Yeah, well, it could be, and you'd have to look at those at a developmental perspective. For one, you certainly would. You know, some things learners learn like that period of, we'll call it chunkhood, or could be extremely short. Like they hear and I, and then 2 minutes, and so the learner logs and I as an exemplar in their mind and goes, okay, I heard and I, all right, and then the learner hears and he, and very quickly in that same talk, the learner is like, oh, I can do and plus anything else. So the lifespan of that moving from chunked exemplar to grammatical function can be very quick, right? Yeah.
Were you able to ask your subjects as well if they envision certain things as chunks or not?
I wanted to. I just didn't really have the scope at the time, and also at the time I was collecting the data, I didn't really have enough of an I was still looking at the data.
Yeah. I understand.
You know, and I think, you know, part of the problem is that if you're making conclusions about your data, like the transcription process took forever.
Yeah.
And I was transcribing while I was recording, but it still took forever. That, you know, maybe like if I were able to have a conversation with Wakey 6 months later, his analysis at 6 months later might not necessarily have been the analysis at that time.
Exactly.
A. B, his analysis actually might have been, that's a moment where his conscious mind, the one that was instructed for 12 years, can go, no, they're separate.
Yeah.
Because his education is speaking there, but his neurology is doing something else.
Yeah. You
Okay,
may not
because
have
we-
understood what you're trying to
Yeah. And I open this up to questions now because we're kind of looking at 5 minutes before the end.
So for very, very beginners, what kind of chunks would you use with very, very beginners?
Okay.
From what you've
Yep.
found?
Yep. Okay. So I'll tell you what. So first, we want to distinguish what are the things we teach versus what do they do when they pick something up. Okay. So I'm not necessarily. I'm not advocating. If I were to advocate, hey, teach chunks because the brain has this natural way of breaking stuff down. Okay. Then that lends an argument to the teaching. I'm not going to say okay, right? That lends an argument to the, yeah, we're going to close that out. That lends an argument to, okay, teach a whole list of chunks because the brain is going to do something profitable with it. Okay? And at least at this stage of research, it can't necessarily say that, all right? But what it does say is, look, the brain does have a natural tendency. So I would advocate to you, you know what? First of all, it does learners a wealth of benefits to get them beyond a word level analysis. So yes, like the Berlitz method, teach them phrases rather than discrete vocabulary items plus like an algebraic grammar. Okay? Because ultimately that's really, I think, more reflective of how we use language. Furthermore, don't stick with just like idioms, like kick the bucket, which is kind of how we often associate chunks, or formulaic sequences is the other term. You know, do some of the other stuff that you find here, and get them to use some of like I don't know, it's a pretty idiomatic thing, and talk about, Okay? And if learners have problems remembering what prepositions go with what, well then teach the verb and the preposition combination. Okay? So that you are drawing their attention to word groups rather than isolated words. But my study didn't look at that. Hua Nguyen actually, she actually did a study on formulaic sequences and what the brain does, like what scenarios create the likelihood that the brain is going to hold on to sequences. So in a way, she's kind of looking at them coming into the brain and does the brain hold on to them, and I'm looking to what does the brain do once they're held on to. So we're kind of, we dovetail in that respect. Any question? Did you have a question in the back? No?
I know you mentioned this is a limitation of for your study, but how did you gauge the effects of cross-linguistic influence over learners' formation and production of chunks in the target language? For example, you have the example they have 3 dogs.
Yeah.
Actually, that sentence is perfectly grammatical in Chinese.
In Chinese. And so is fire flower, apparently, which means like fireworks. Yeah, so point is like there's no denying that there was L1 influence in the data. And so I would say, at least informally, there's no denying that the L1, given that it is an entire history of language use patterns, that the brain is going to use some of its wiring for working in the second language. Okay, what ultimately we care about is, well, how do you get those patterns to change? But I certainly agree. I mean, I think it was more of a tacit observation in. Actually, I did mention it in chapter 6. It was about 2 lines long, saying, "Hey, there's no denying that there was L1 influence, but there was just no scope in the study to talk about the extent or how." So.
Right. That they have 3 dogs probably is a case of transfer to somewhere.
Yeah. Because at least English provided a very similar structure, just slightly formally different,
Right.
similar use. So, another question? Well, thank you very, very much for coming.